So, hello everybody. As you know, we're in the World Cup started. So, I'm wearing my England top, and Dina's wearing his. Oh, sorry, I forgot Italy aren't in the World Cup. Never mind, Dino.
Going to
So
be in
it's,
my top, and I thought, well, we're not in it, so what's the point?
and you can wear
Yeah,
your Scotland top on Saturday night anyway. So,
yeah.
um, anyway, so Dino, while I was been away, had a few karting experience. Now, I would have had karting experiences to share with everybody who likes our karting experience, as long as it's not with the wonderful people from Glasgow who don't like sharing with us. It's nice to share, it's nice to care, but they don't care, so they don't share. So anyway, I was in Austria last week, and I was in the beautiful city of Vienna, and we went. Me and my family went into a lot of places in Vienna, doing a lot of walking in the city centre and going to places. And literally for the 4 days I was there, when we got into the city centre where all the places to visit are around the cathedral and down by where the Danube Canal is, it was literally a carter fest. You couldn't turn without seeing the carters everywhere. And there was like groups of four of them. One cart stand had English literature, and the other one I think was clearly in German literature, because I think they speak German in Austria, or a variation of it. Um, and my wife spotted them first, and she just said to me, "Don't you dare!" And so I was warned, and I tried to sneak off a few times, but it wasn't happening, man. And then of course the next day there they are again. Turn around the corner, then some more, and then again. It just literally everywhere you went. And of course, you know what I'm going to say next. They were just talking amongst themselves, and at no point from all the many carters in this cart fest in Vienna, none of them was speaking to anyone. And then we travelled as a family to Salzburg, in this city that you walked a lot into it, and we traveled a lot, and I can tell you it was Carter free. Not one Carter was spotted in Salzburg. And so I had more enjoyable time in there apart from the weather, because I wasn't reminded about the Jehovah's Witnesses. So if you want to go somewhere without seeing any Jehovah's Witnesses, I recommend 3 days in Salzburg. But anyway, Dino's got, like I said, I've got nothing to share. So over to Dino with your experiences.
Yeah, well, just today I was up the high street, had to go into the town, and yeah, so a couple of experiences. The first one, I'll just make my way back down the town, and two young Latter-day Saints, Mormon girls were coming up, and I saw the badges, and I thought they're going to stop me because I don't know. I always get stopped. I've got one of those faces, I think, that tells people I'm not going to bite their heads off, so they're safe to approach. I was thinking the only time that good-looking young women approach me in the street these days, they're either a charity worker or they're a Mormon missionary. But yeah, so they
Disco
stopped me.
prostitute.
So they stopped me, and first of all, you've got to say, well, respect to them in the fact that they're actually on the street and they're actually trying to speak to people, you know, um, just walking along and stopping people and trying to start conversations. So they're actually doing a ministry. So fair dues to them. And all they really said to me at first was just directly invite me to their meetings, to their church, come along to our meetings, you know. So I said to them, I don't attend any church or associate with any religious group anymore, any denomination, because I realized some years ago I was fed up being told what to believe rather than finding out for myself, which is what I try to do now. You tie yourself to any denomination and you're tied to exactly what they believe, and you've got to go along with, exactly what the hierarchy say. So I don't want to attend your church, but thanks for the invite. Um, and we go into the kind of, I was saying to them that I didn't think there was any one church that had sort of sole authority to teach and teach the truth, And it got them onto the thought about authority, and they were saying, they said to me that the authority for the church ended when Jesus and the apostles died, right? So
Okay.
when they left the earthly scene, that God's, if you like, use of the church and authority through the church was dormant until Joseph Smith came
Yeah.
along,
Just
and then the church authority was with him. So that's the kind of line they were going down. But I kind of said to them, why is it, do you think, that the Bible doesn't say that, right? That the authority would end with the apostles, and neither does the Bible actually make any provision for apostolic succession. So it does neither. It neither says it's coming to an end, and it neither outlines how to, say, appoint and who should be appointed successors to the apostles and how that authority should go on, basically. I said, why do you think that is? And they didn't really know. So I said to them, is it not the case? And this is the thing, we had this point with the witnesses some time ago in Glasgow. I made the point to them that when you read the scriptures, that the early Christians, the first century Christians, believed that the parousia, Jesus was coming back in their
mm,
day, in their lifetime. And if you read the Apostle Paul's letters and letters of Peter, etc., it's quite clear that they thought that within their lifetime they would see the return of Jesus. So if it was imminent in their view, why would you need to make provision for the appointment of apostolic succession? Because there's not really going to be a succession, because it's going to all come to a head in their time. Um, I said, so that's the reason why it wasn't that it went dormant to wait until the 19th, 20th century for Latter-day Saints or whatever. It's that the original prophecies of the imminent parousia didn't work out, right? So she said, well, it didn't come true. I said, well, exactly, it didn't come true.
mm.
So she said, and this is the same thing that witness had said to us at Buchanan Station, at Queen Street Station, that she says, well, that was because I referred her to First Thessalonians chapter 4, right? And she says, oh, but that's maybe just Paul's opinion or Paul's interpretation, right? So it
Mm,
says, but do you believe that the Apostle Paul was inspired? Because if he was inspired, then why would he be inspired to say something
mm.
that turns out to be completely wrong? That doesn't make sense at all. Um, and I said to her, because we read the First Thessalonians 4, and I said to all academic authorities recognize that fact. It's not down to just an opinion. It's that all the academia, they realize that that is what those scriptural passages are saying. They thought it was imminent in their day. Um, so she says, well, where is that in the Bible? And I said, First Thessalonians 4 and verse 15. I says, in fact, look it up and see for yourself that that's what it says. So they pull out their mobile phones, much like the witnesses. They've got their translations all on the phone. So they look it up. And I says, so basically Paul says, we the living who survive to the coming of the Lord. Right? So she looks it up and she reads it, and it says, they who are living when the Lord comes.
Ah,
And I says, what translation is that you're reading? And they were kind of hummed and hawed a wee bit. And I said, no, what translation is it are you reading from? And she said, oh, the King James. But then she showed me that on the phone. I looked at it, and it said JST as the
mm,
translation, JST, which is the Joseph Smith translation.
mm.
Right? It's based on the King James, but it's the Joseph Smith translation. And it says,
Yeah.
and I looked it up on the internet today as well, and it says, they, the living, not we. And I says to
Mm,
her, no, that's completely wrong. I says, that's corrupting what the Greek
wow.
text says. The Greek
Mm,
says we. So I looked up the Greek just to double check, and got both interlinear translations here. The Diaglot, Kingdom Interlinear. One's the Griesbach text, and the New World one is the Westcott and Hort text. So two different Greek texts for these interlinears, and they both say we. The Greek is, pardon my Greek, but it's hemes ois dontes oi perilepometnoi esten parousian to Kyriou. So it's we the living remaining at the coming of the Lord. The Greek word hemes means we, but they've changed it to they, and changed completely the understanding of that text. I says, no, I says, I'm sorry, it says, but that's completely opposite to what the scriptures actually say. It doesn't say they who are living, it says we who are living. So again, it just shows you that you've got to be careful with these groups. And like the witnesses, they will amend and alter the translations according to the dogma rather than to what the
the other
truth
way
of the
around.
actual text is. So we got talking further, and I said to them, look, I'm coming out with this stuff. I says, because I actually study theology at university. And they says, oh, we've done 4 years of theology study. I says, oh, what university did you go to? And he says, well, it wasn't university, it was seminary. I says, oh, right, so a Latter-day Saint seminary. Yeah. I says, well, you're not going to get an unbiased education in that. You're going to get the LDS version, and follow that. And I just finished off. I says, there's other things we could talk about. I says, you get Elohim and Jehovah mixed up the wrong way. You got them. You say that Jesus is Jehovah and the Father is Elohim. I says, but if you look at the scriptures, it's the other way around. Psalm 110. If you look at that, you've got it all wrong. So eventually, they excused themselves and they brought the conversation to an end and walked off. Says, thank them for stopping me in the wee chat, but
there you go.
They'd had enough as well. I have that effect on people. But it's funny that the last young girls I spoke to in the town that had stopped me, these two, they looked like 18. They looked like barely 18 years of age. And the last ones I spoke to were much the same. And they were telling me that they have to pay their own way here. They have to pay their own way while they're here, and they have to pay their way back. The church pays nothing. And these young girls are over here on their own, trying to do this work. And again, how safe is that? If I had an 18-year-old daughter, I wouldn't want her going across to the Atlantic doing a work like this on her own, just with some other girls. It's really. You ever seen the film Heretic with Hugh Grant? Yeah. So why would you let young girls like that on their own?
Yes.
Yeah.
Especially with Hugh Grant.
So anyway, after that, I carried on. Now, when I had been coming up the street, just across from the Wallace Tower, there's a shop which is now closed down. It was on this corner, and it's got one of these angled entrances with a pillar. And when I was walking up, I was looking for the witnesses, and they used to stand at the tower, and they weren't there. But anyway, I was walking past, and then all of a sudden I saw these three women standing in this closed shop, the front of this closed shop. There's a wee sort of alcove, and the three of them were standing and talking. And I actually totally missed the cart. The cart was kind of sitting side on, and I totally missed it from where it was sitting. And I kind of crossed the road and looked back, and I realised I then saw the cart, and I saw they were witnesses. So I'd gone on to the shops, coming back down, spoke to the two Mormon girls, and I thought, right, I'll see if the witnesses are still there, and I'll have a word. So I walks up, and again, what it is the angle of the shop and the alcove, it was now just two of them were standing, but they're standing in under the alcove, And as you're walking down the street approaching it, you don't see them,
Yeah.
right? All you see is this cart sitting on the pavement, right? And you don't see them. So they're not even standing by the cart. They're a good 4 feet away from the cart. So anyway, I walked up to the cart and I was looking at the magazines. So then they kind of they noticed me, and one of the women was one that I'd spoken to a couple of times before. It was the one that said that she doesn't get into the nitty gritty of things like 1914. So she recognised me, I recognised her. I was hoping it was going to be somebody else so you could speak to someone fresh, somebody new. But anyway, I says to her, I says, have you not got any new blood brochures for the carts? You know, any because you've had the update on the bloods. So is there an up-to-date blood booklet or anything? And she goes, no, no, nothing on the blood booklets. And I says, oh, that's interesting because I says I've been watching the video on the blood on jw.org, and I've got some questions about it. And she says to me, um, well, why didn't you just tap in the question on the website and ask the question? And I says, you can't ask questions on the website. I mean, there is a search function and you might put in a subject that you want to know about, and it might lead you to pages where it's like questions from readers or questions that might be asked. I says, but there's no function on your website where if you've watched a video that you can then ask a question, the questions that come to your mind, not questions that the society might raise. And she goes, oh, you can't do that. I says, no. And she says, well, I didn't know that. I thought, yeah. Let's see. So they'd asked about she didn't, right, and I could tell when I'd raised the point about the blood, she didn't want to go down that route, obviously. And she was standing with another elderly sister as well, just the two of them, and there was no brother bouncer about. I'd had a look to see who else was about. There was nobody there. But anyway, we got into a nice enough, friendly enough conversation. So I was asking about um, the video, and she started off trying to sort of give an explanation about the blood and about any change. And again, she kind of ummed and awed, and she started to say something. And as she was trying to get it out, I think she realised she didn't know where she was going with it. And she kind of just kind of the thread broke down as to what she had to say, you know. And I says, well, look, I says the questions I have is that the video says that you can now take your own blood to be transfused after it's been stored, and you can do that now. I says, but Acts 15, you've always said it's abstain from blood. And if you have to abstain from blood, and that means no transfusions because you've not to eat the blood. So if a transfusion is eating blood, I said, so how is it now you can transfuse your own blood? Because surely that's eating your own blood, you know? So I says, that's clearly a contradiction. And she said, no, I don't think it's a contradiction. You know, and I says to her, are you sure you've actually watched this video? Because she says she did, but I really don't know that a lot of these witnesses have actually watched the video or watched it and really understood it. Because I said to her that it said that the principle was, lose my train of thought. Yeah, medical cases, the Bible is silent on one's use of their own blood for medical care, right? That's the point the video makes. I says, but if that's the case, the Bible's also silent on using anybody else's blood for medical care. So if it's silent on one thing and it's okay, then why is it silent on another thing but it's not okay? You know? Now, she made one half decent point. She says, well, the difference is the DNA. I said, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by the DNA? Well, she says, well, your own DNA is exclusive to you, right? And I says, oh, you mean like a fingerprint? we've all got our own unique fingerprints, we've all got our own unique DNA. She says, yeah. So she was saying that you wouldn't want to take the blood of somebody else because that's got their DNA, but you could take your own blood because it's your own DNA, right? And I says, well, but that kind of still circumvents the point as to whether you can eat blood. If eating blood is wrong, it doesn't really matter whether it's someone else's or if it is just your own, because you're still eating the blood by transfusing it. So I said to Luke, I says, in Scotland, in particular in the UK, we like people like their blood sausage, they like the black pudding, right? I said, so it's normally pig's blood with oats and herbs and things, and you make a black pudding. Oh, well, you can't eat black pudding. I says, oh, I know, I know. I said, I don't like eating it. I wouldn't eat it. I says, but the principle is that you're using blood as a foodstuff, and you're not allowed to eat it because that would break the abstinence in Acts 15. I says, but the point you're making, if it's okay to transfuse your own blood because it's your own, could you take a pint of your own blood, mix it with oats and herbs, and make a black pudding sausage and eat that? Oh, no, 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 you couldn't do that. And the other wee women, no, 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 you won't do that. And I says, well, that's the point. I says, so if you wouldn't eat your own blood as a food, then why would you transfuse it? If transfusing is eating it, And also I said to her that this is what she said. She says to me, she says, the blood issue is such a small thing now. I says, what? She says, it's such a small thing. She says that there's so many advances now, and they can do this circulatory thing where they just circulate your blood. And I says, no, no, I says, that's a procedure that is allowed, yeah, because the circuit of the blood hasn't stopped. You can consider that. I said, but that's not what we're talking about. That obviously just came back into our mind. Oh, the circulation of the blood and this wee machine and all that. I said, but we're not. That's a separate thing about the blood. Um, I said, but try saying to the parents of children who've died because they didn't get didn't take blood or didn't have the opportunity to take a homologous blood storage and then retransfusion, and then lost their child, and now this change has come in. I says, you should try saying to those parents, oh, the blood issue, it's such a small thing. Couldn't believe it. But she says, no, no, that's not a contradiction. And I said, I think it is a contradiction. She says, oh, she says, Jehovah doesn't change, it's just that we get a better understanding of things, right? But anyway, at one point, the wee second sister that was there, she kind of, when she's kind of listening to this, take no part in the conversation, really. And I'm finding this whenever we've spoken to the ones in Glasgow, there's always seems to be the wee sister or one or two who just stand and never say a word, never look like they're going to get involved in the conversation. It's almost as if there's ones just tagging along. And they seem to, I get the impression, particularly as I say, with the way they where they stand out of view almost, and the cart on its own. Again, they're really not looking to speak to anybody. But anyway, this older sister, finally piped up, and she was going, "Oh no," she says, "You can't take the blood out of the body and store it." She says, "When the blood leaves the body, it has to go into the ground." Right now, which is the scriptural view in Leviticus, right? But I says to the main woman, I says, because she then turned to her as if to say, no, 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 shut up, stop. Aye, you don't, that's wrong, it's like, shush. And I says, you need to have a word with her. I says, because she doesn't understand that that's exactly what your new light is saying you can do. You can store it once it's left the body. So again, I think, crikey, they're standing on these carts, spouting this. They don't even know what they are meant to believe. They
Oh.
can't explain it. And then half of them don't know what it is they're meant to be explaining in the first place, you know. This was the other woman was the same woman whose husband, who was an elder, had tried to tell me before that in the first century there was those of the other sheep of the earthly calling were there in the first century along with the anointed, and she had to
Mm.
stop him and correct him, and he was the elder.
Yeah.
I thought, "You really don't know what they're talking about." Um, yeah, and then just to kind of finish off, at one point I must have said to them something about what your church believes, and she says to me, "Oh, we're not a church." And I said, "What?" She says, "No, no, we're not a church. We're a Kingdom Hall." And I said, "No, I'm not talking about the building." I says that
Mm.
the Christian church, the congregation, the ecclesia, that the people are the church. So you, the church. Oh no, no, we're not
Mm.
a church. We're not a church. And I'm going, bloody hell. These folk don't even, that's the level. I says, you know, it's 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 semantics. You don't even understand. And then I said to her, I then started to speak to her about, well, why did you were you always a Jehovah's Witnesses or did you become a Jehovah? And she says, oh, she was Church of Scotland, right?
Right.
And then she became a witness. I said, so what was it that kind of changed your mind? Did you have to change your view in some things? And she says, well, for instance, she said basically just to know that God had a name, to know why we're here and what the future holds. That was the big things for her. She said, I didn't even know that the Trinity existed. I says, what, as a Church of Scotland member, you didn't know that God was supposed to be
Mm.
a Trinity? No, I didn't know that until I became a witness. I said, so why
Yeah.
why don't you believe in the Trinity? And she says, well, it's not in the Bible. I says, right, right. So you don't believe that because it's not, it has to be in the Bible for you to believe it. So brought out my old favourite. So why do you believe that Jesus is the archangel, Archangel
Mm.
Michael? Why do you believe that? I says, where have you read that in Scripture? And she went, right. She says, no, that's a question. She says, oh, I can't think. And I says, well, maybe it isn't actually. It's maybe that you haven't actually read that in the Bible. Maybe that's just what the Watchtower has told you, but you haven't actually
Mm.
read it. I said, so if you don't believe the Trinity because it's not in the Bible, why do you believe that he's the Archangel Michael? And she says, what, you don't believe Jesus is an angel in heaven right now? I says, no, no, not an angel. And she says, oh, no, no, Jesus is an angel. I says, oh, wait a minute. I says, the elder I've spoken to several times, he mentioned his name. And I says, I've spoken to him several times. And he was adamant that Jesus isn't an angel. And you're now telling me Jesus is an angel. I says, he was adamant he's an archangel, which is different from an angel. But you're now saying he is an angel. I says, you really don't know what you are talking about. You are confused. You are not saying you're not singing from the same hymn sheet, you know. I says, You've got to get your doctrines right. And she says, we don't have doctrines.
Oh,
I
dear.
says, you don't have doctrine. No, we don't have doctrines. I says, yes, you do. I says, any teaching that you have is your doctrine. You know, we don't
Mm.
have doctrines. We're not a church. I'm thinking,
Cheers.
what is this? What they clearly they I says to her, I don't mean to be rude. I says, but you appear to have a very simple faith,
Yes.
and that
Yeah.
you really don't. And she said, oh, great. She says, it's simple. I like it simple. I know what I believe. And I says, well, I said, it's
Mm.
not very convincing. There's no reason you've given me to think that I should come back to your Kingdom Hall. Um, you know. So that was my experience today. I just thought a couple of interesting experiences. Um,
It's it's
but
funny when you said that about about abstaining from blood. Imagine about that. Oh, if it's your own blood and your own DNA, it's all right. But the thing is, imagine if it was the same for alcohol,
Mm.
and you abstain from alcohol, which
Mm.
meant you couldn't go to a pub or you come back from the supermarket. But if you brewed it at home,
Ah, yes, yes, breed your own.
yes,
Yeah,
brewed your
yeah.
own. You see, that thing it's like because it's your own. Right.
Mhm.
Anyway, yes, that was it. Just what you said just confirms everything we've thought. Anyway, when it comes to, and we still haven't got an answer on this one, to be fair. So we'll just have to still see if we can get somebody can give us a proper answer on this one.
Yeah, because they definitely, I really get the impression of most of them that they've either watched this video once
Yeah,
or they've not watched it at all. If they have watched it, I don't really think they've really reasoned on it
yeah,
so that they would actually see the clear contradiction in the
mm,
position. And they're
yeah,
just not interested. They don't want to go there. They just want to um, believe very simply in a paradise earth and that they're the true religion,
yes,
and that's it, you know?
yeah. That's it. That's it. But that
Mhm.
was the point you made about the would you use your own to make black pudding.
Good,
I'd
yeah.
not thought about that, and it's yeah, that's a really good point. Right, anyway, I think we're gonna have to wrap up now because
Yeah.
I'm 6 minutes late into watching the France game. And then we'll be playing tomorrow. But thank you again for your experience there, with Vicky.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh dear.
Just wondering, these experiences we're having, I just wonder how many people viewing these videos, whether they would take up the challenge to speak to Carters as well and maybe give some experiences and comments. We should start a campaign, approach the Carters,
Yeah,
and
I
you
don't.
know,
Yeah, and we can only just encourage people to go out. They don't have to record it. Just try and
mm,
let's find if anybody can just have a chat to them and say, can we just get the definitive answer on this new light of blood? Because it's just not making any sense to us, and they're
yeah,
not making any sense to themselves. And it's surely worrying if you're in an organization and you're diminishing that the blood is nothing anymore when we know people have died by adhering to the previous policy. It's weird. Right, anyway, we'll have to go. So thank you again, Dino. So it's a
no
goodbye
problem.
from me.
It was good to buy from
And
him.
bye-bye.